Speechless, the film you just watched, is not necessarily just a film. It's not just a movie, it's a picture. It's a picture of my life and it's a picture of your life. It's really the whole of our experience here on this earth. There's tragedy, there's heartbreak, we see hope. At the end, we see healing and redemption. That's the story of all of us. We can relate to the characters, Jonah and Morgan, and the relationship we see there. The question for us after watching this film is, what is Speechless trying to say? What does the story mean to us? When I watch Speechless, I'm reminded of Acts chapter 9, the story of Saul being converted to Paul. I want to read you the text. It's verse 3 is where we'll start. It says this: As he was traveling, it happened. He was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up, enter the city, and it will be told to you what you must do. The men who traveled with him stood speechless. They stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. Verse 8, Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. He was there for 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. The film starts with Jonah at a funeral. It appears that his life has been flipped upside down suddenly. In these verses we just read, it tells us in verse 3 that while Saul was walking, it happened suddenly. That's how life works. That's what tragedy looks like. We don't get to plot and plan when bad things happen to us. We don't get a heads up on when the bottom of our life is going to fall out. Life happens to us all of a sudden, and it's no different for Jonah. The question for us is that when life happens, what do we do? How do we respond? In those moments when the bottom of our life falls out, what do we do? Where do we go? And most importantly, who do we listen to? What about you? What does that look like in your life? Maybe right now you're going through a difficult time. Your parents have split up. There's a relationship in your life that is really difficult, or it's hard. Maybe school's tough. Maybe you're struggling with your academics. Maybe you're worried about the future. There's anxiety and fear. And we watch the film, we see that with Jonah, don't we? Just what do I do? Where do I go? How do I rebound from this? Maybe you can relate to that in Jonah's life. Once again, when the bottom of our life falls out, when tragedy happens, it becomes really important to listen to the right voices. In our text in verse 4, it tells us that Saul fell to the ground and he immediately heard a voice. When we find ourselves in difficult situations, it's so important that we begin to block out all the noise. We live in a world today that's full of so much static. I mean, think about it. Your phone, social media, relationships, people pulling at you, people telling you things that you should do and shouldn't do. There's so much noise in our lives. When we find ourselves at a crossroads, when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, it's incredibly important to begin to block out all the noise and to begin to listen to the right voices. I'm convinced in life that noise simply creates confusion. John chapter 10, verse 10, it tells us something very important. It's very simple and practical, that the enemy, the thief, comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Destroy what? Steal what? Kill what? It's very simple. The plan and the purpose that God has for our life. When confusion comes in, when the noise creates confusion in our life, it becomes incredibly difficult for us to hear and to know what God wants to do in us and through us. There's a great line in the movie where Chuck tells Jonah to simply don't worry about saying anything, just listen. It's so important in these moments and times in life that we simply stop, fall to our knees, block out the noise, and listen to the right voice. The most compelling and obvious connection between Paul's story and Jonah's story is that they both were found paralyzed. Jonah, in the movie, he's speechless. And when we read the text, we see that Paul is sightless. Why did God take Paul's sight? Why in the film does Jonah lose his ability to speak? God took Paul's sight. So Saul Paul could begin to see himself for who he really was. I'm convinced that in that moment that his sight was gone, that Paul began to look deep within himself and ask himself, who really am I? We see that in the film. We see Jonah begin to dig deep into who he is. That's the first step towards healing. When we get honest with ourselves, when we get honest about who we are, who we're not, we can begin to see God's plan for our life and who he wants us to be, who he says that we are. It requires us to dig deep into our lives. When I watch Speechless, to me, honestly, the unsung hero is Morgan. When we read the text about Saul converting to Paul, we see in verse 8, it says that Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he couldn't see anything, but some people led him by the hand. I'm thankful that God puts people in our lives, people like Morgan, who when we need them most are there. They're the ones that refuse to give up on us. They're the ones that see the best in us. They're the ones that want to help in any way that they can. Man, we all need people like Morgan in our life to hold us by the hand and lead us to healing, to help us put the broken pieces of our life back together. Throughout the film, if I'm honest, my heart breaks. My heart breaks for Jonah. I think when you watch the film, we all want him so desperately to get those words out of his mouth. Why? We all can relate to being paralyzed. We all can relate to being paralyzed by anxiety and fear and worry and concern. We want to see healing come into Jonah's life. The good news for all of us is that God doesn't leave us broken. Even though he took Paul's sight, he restored it. Verse 18, it tells us in the text that Saul regained his sight. We watch the movie, watch the film. Jonah regains his ability to speak. It's a picture of something very practical and very simple that God wants to do in all of us. He wants to make us whole. Why? So that we can begin to participate in his plan and his purpose for our lives. That's exactly what we see. Saul's sight and Jonah's voice are simply a first step in participating in God's plan and purpose for their lives. That's what he wants for all of us. He wants to take the broken pieces of our life and not make things perfect. There's no magic wands here, but just an opportunity to participate in his perfect plan for our life. What might happen in your life and in my life if we just sat speechless for a little while? I think we'll begin to hear clearly God's voice, his truth, and we'll know that our identity is found in him and him alone, and nothing else in this world can take that away. The truth of who we are, it's found in a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, and we'll find in him we can truly find our voice.